Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at Egypt during the Archaic Period in our continuing study of world civilizations. Actually, I want to back up all the way to what we call the Pre-Dynastic period, back before 3000 BC. Before they had dynasties, one of the much later Egyptian historians by the name of Manetho, writing during the Greek period, says that that there were 30 dynasties of Egypt. But going back to the pre-dynastic, before there were any of these dynasties, before Egypt was unified, there was something, we're told, of a climate change, where the Sahara just became much more desert-like. The Sahara was already there, but it now extended further, both to the north and to the south. And that meant that suddenly Egypt, or the Nile River, was now running through almost continuously through the desert, except for the Nile River Valley. And this led people to migrate to it. You know, people are looking for water. Whenever you're going to have people looking for a home, the first thing they need is water and food. Where are they going to get that? Well, if they're anywhere in that area, they're going to come to the Nile River. That's going to attract them. And they begin to build structures on which to live, mud brick structures, and using maybe silos for grain as they're beginning to build not just hunting and gathering, but now farms. And they're farming in the Nile Valley. And the Nile Valley is great for that because it floods every year. And you say, well, it's terrible. No, actually, it's good. The Nile River floods every year, but it's a very seasonal flooding. It very gradually the water comes up. It's not rushing and destructive. The water just rises a good 20 feet or so, and then it goes down after a couple months. And when it goes down, it has left a very rich black topsoil. And so we have evidence of early cattle compounds and silos for grains and farming and farming going on. And Egypt is now becoming, can we call it that, becoming civilized. There's this pastoral and people that are farming and growing food. And of course, when they're not growing food, they're fighting each other to get some food. And so there's that competition just within Egypt from maybe one tribe to the next. Now, here's a map of Egypt, one that you probably haven't seen before. You say, well, gee, that looks like it's upside down. And the Egyptians would say, no, actually that's right side up, because to the south, that's, at the top of our map, to the south they referred to that as Upper Egypt, and down at the delta where the Nile River, as it flows into the Mediterranean, it splits into a number of different heads. They refer to that as Lower Egypt. After all, you're a bit lower there, and you're right down at sea level. And so the Egyptians, they didn't have maps, but if they would have had maps, they would have oriented them this way, because the word for south actually means at the top, and the word for north means below in Egyptian, and the word for west has the idea of being on my right hand, and the the Egyptian word for east has the idea of being on my left hand. And so now I'm not going to use this map for the rest of our time together. Just wanted to share that with you. Maybe a just different way of looking at Egypt. But now let's look at it more traditionally. Again, we have the Nile River, and this time we're oriented where north is at the top of our map, like we're used to seeing. But as we said, the northern part of Egypt, that part of the delta, is known as Lower Egypt. And so that's sort of counterintuitive when we look at a map. And then at the bottom of the map, or the south part of the map, that was referred to as Upper Egypt. Anything south of the delta was Upper Egypt. The kings of Lower Egypt wore a red crown, and it had, notice, what looks like a little papyri leaf, a long skinny leaf that comes out in curls that stuck out from the crown. And then the kings of Upper Egypt, they wore a white crown, looked like a tulip that hadn't quite bloomed yet. And what we're going to see happen in Egypt is that one person is going to take over Egypt, is going to bring Egypt under submission, where he will rule both Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. He will take the red crown and the white crown, and he will combine them into one single crown. and this will be the Pharaoh. Now, one place where we see this, we're not going to see both crowns united, but we see the Narmer Pallet. Now, the king that's depicted here, he's also known, I think it was by the Greeks probably, as Pharaoh Menes. This dates to about 3000 BC, and it's commemorating the unification of Egypt. Notice the pallet. It depicts the pharaoh. He's the big guy in the middle. He's in the position of striking and smiting. He's got his hand upon one hand is upon the enemy, the other hand is raised with a mace or club, and then down below his feet are his conquered enemies. And he's the victorious king. But notice he's wearing, now you can't see what color the crown is, but just from the shape you know it's the white crown of Upper Egypt. And then you go to the other side, and you see again the king. He's on that up near the top, not all the way to the top, but he's head and shoulders above the other people. He's the biggest guy, and this time he's wearing the red crown, and you can see the papyri leaf, sort of rolled up. And then down below him, in the next section below, there are two animals, sort of strange-looking animals with very long necks. They remind us a little bit maybe of giraffes, but they're not giraffes. They're something else, and their necks are intertwined to show that Egypt, this country these two countries, have now been intertwined. They've been joined together to make one country. And of course, notice the Pharaoh back up there that we looked at first. He's leading his people, and they are doing a procession out before him, and they are carrying the trophies of their victory. And then out in front of them are all the headless people of those that they've conquered, the conquered dead. Now I want to zoom in on that front side of the Narmer Pallet. Again, this is 3000 BC. And I want you to notice that this sets the artistic way that the Pharaoh is depicted for the next 3,000 years. We look at this picture and then put one right next to it of Ramses IV, a full, 2,000 years later, just about, in 1150 BC. And he's depicted wearing the same crown. It's that upper crown. And now sometimes he'd be depicted maybe wearing the king of the crown of Lower Egypt, but he's in the same position, the position of smiting. He's got a slightly different weapon. He still has you can see the beard, and it's a beard that has, notice the chin strap, where the beard is actually strapped on. He's smooth shaven, but he has a ceremonial beard that he's wearing, and the art never changed in Egypt. It continued to depict the Pharaoh the same way in early Egypt as in much, much, much later Egypt. So we have now the Archaic Period to which we come. And the Archaic Period begins with the unification. That's why we're looking at the Narmer Pallet. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. The capital eventually is going to be at Memphis, and Memphis, of course, near where Cairo is, where you have the delta, and where Lower Egypt meets Upper Egypt. That's where we're going to put. The capital, sort of just south of the delta region of Egypt. The civil and religious institutions and ceremonies, just like the art, these institutions, these ceremonies, are going to assume the form they will maintain throughout the entire dynastic period. You see, nothing ever changes in Egypt. They're very conservative. The way they would do things were the way they would continue doing it throughout the entire history of Egypt. And yet we start with this Archaic Period where the temples and the palaces are made of wood, and they are made of brick. But eventually I'm going to have a sort of structure that's going to be made of something much longer lasting. I will have a structure that's made of granite stone. But I want to talk about mythology now. Mythology. Egyptian mythology, first of all, we start off with Geb and Nut, and they are married. That's the earth. Geb is the earth, and Nut is the sky. She's pictured here. Notice there's actually one tomb in the Valley of the Kings that I've been inside, and you go inside, and the entire roof is painted blue, dark blue, with these stars painted, and just like the picture you're seeing. And then right across the middle of the roof is Nut. She's stretching over because she's the sky, and she is all those stars and so on. And so Geb and Nut, they're going to be married, and Geb and Nut are going to have 3 children, so that there is Osiris and Isis and Set. Now, Isis and Osiris are going to be married themselves. You say, well, that's sort of weird, brother and sister. But that's something they did back in the ancient world, and we're going to see that carried out in Egypt, among the pharaohs in particular, for quite a lot of their history. So Isis and Osiris. Now Osiris, he's sort of the hero god. He's going to be sort of the hero, and yet his life will be taken, and he'll be resurrected, and we're going to talk about how that happens. And then there's Isis, and she has the power of resurrection, the power to give life, and we're going to see how that comes out in the story. And then there's the other brother, Seth. He's the villain. He's the bad guy. He's depicted with the head of a jackal, and that's not a good thing. And eventually we're going to see Isis and Osiris. They're going to have a son, and that will be Horus. Now Horus is always depicted with the head. I don't know if he's always depicted this way, but usually depicted with the head of a falcon, and that's how you can recognize Horus. So in the mythology, we have Isis and Osiris, and you remember that's the husband and wife team, and they bring civilization to mankind. But then Seth tricks Osiris into getting into a coffin. He builds this coffin, and he builds it to the dimensions of Osiris, and sort of says, let's play a game. Who can fit into this coffin? It's sort of like the old Cinderella story. Who can fit into this slipper? And Osiris gets into the coffin, and it's a trap. And he's trapped in the coffin, and he's killed. And his body's cut in pieces and hidden. But that's okay, because Isis comes and collects all the pieces, all the ones she can find. She's got to make up one in one case. I'm not going to get into the details. But she resurrects Osiris, and so he had been dead, and then he's alive for a time. But he's going to be the god of the dead, because he's the god who died. And yet rose again. And then Osiris, like I said, he becomes the god of the dead. And then Isis, because Isis and Osiris, were together, she gives birth now to Horus. And Horus is the one who takes up the fight against Seth. And Horus defeats Seth, doesn't kill him, but defeats Seth. And so, good wins out over evil in the end, and it's a good story. Now, these kings, from going back to the very early dynasties, you have a king who reigns, and we're going to see one king that reigns for close to 90 years. We're going to see others that reign for a very, very long time. There'll be some times when they don't reign so long. But once a king had reigned, a long time, remember, the king is the one who's leading you into battle, and he's supposed to be the one who brings order and victory and prosperity to the nation. And what happens if the king is old and feeble? That's not going to work so well. And so what the Egyptians would do, once the king had reigned for 30 years, he would have a Heb-Sed Festival, a festival that would symbolically give him rejuvenation, that would give him new life, that would say, look, he's really not that old. And what he would do, he would show that he's physically able to do things. He'd go out and he'd run a race course, and he'd race against the younger men, or he'd take a bow and arrow and he'd stretch the bow and shoot arrows, maybe at a target, and I don't know how good a shot he was, but he would do these things. He would go swimming in the Nile. And he would do these things to show, look, I'm still able to be the leader of the armies. I'm still able to take care of everything. And he'd do this on the 30th year of his rule. And then he would do it every 3 years after. And that was sort of the customary thing. Now, we're going to see some examples where a pharaoh, for one reason or another, has a Heb-Sed Festival that's earlier than that. But this was the idea. It was normally held on the 30th year of his rule. And so it was a rejuvenation ceremony to rejuvenate, to make him young again. Didn't really make him young, but to show that he's really fairly young. And so the Egyptians were all about maintaining order and stability.